In the scorching summer of 635, the ancient walls of Damascus trembled under a force they had never known. For centuries, the city had stood as a jewel of the Byzantine Empire, protected by stone, steel, and the pride of Rome itself. But now, at its gates, a new power had arrived. An army born in the desert, forged by faith and led by men who believed their victory was written by God Himself. The defenders looked down from the ramparts and saw what seemed impossible. Thousands of warriors in simple cloth and leather, carrying curved swords and wooden shields, surrounding one of the greatest cities in the world. The Byzantines laughed at first. They had defeated Persians, crushed barbarians, and held these walls for generations. What could desert riders do against Roman stone? But when the dust settled and the sun rose on the seventh day, those same walls would lie broken. The gates would hang open like the mouth of a dying beast, and Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth, would fall in a way that would echo across continents and centuries. This is the story of how everything fell apart. How faith shattered stone, how strategy defeated numbers, and how one battle changed the course of human history forever. The year 635 marked a moment when the world stood on the edge of transformation. For over 1,000 years, the Roman Empire had ruled the Mediterranean and beyond. Even after splitting into East and West, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, remained one of the most powerful forces on earth. Its capital, Constantinople, controlled trade routes, commanded vast armies, and held the wealth of nations. To the south and east, another ancient power had recently collapsed. The Sassanid Persian Empire, after centuries of warfare with Rome, had exhausted itself in endless conflict. The two giants had bled each other dry, their treasuries empty, their armies weary, their people longing for peace. But into this vacuum stepped something entirely new. In the Arabian Peninsula, a religious and political revolution had taken root. The Prophet Muhammad had united the scattered tribes of Arabia under a single banner, the banner of Islam. When he died in 632, the movement did not die with him. Instead, it exploded outward with a force that stunned the ancient world. The early Muslim armies were unlike anything the Byzantines had faced before. They were not barbarian hordes seeking plunder. They were not mercenaries fighting for gold. They were believers fighting for paradise, led by commanders who combined religious zeal with brilliant tactical minds. Within 3 years of Muhammad's death, these armies had conquered all of Arabia, smashed the Persians at the Battle of Qadisiyah, and turned their eyes toward the Byzantine territories of Syria and Palestine. Damascus was the prize they sought above all others. Located in a fertile oasis watered by the Barata River, the city was a center of trade, culture, and military power. Its walls had stood for thousands of years. Within those walls lived Greeks, Syrians, Arabs, Jews, and Armenians, a cosmopolitan mixture that made Damascus one of the most important cities in the Byzantine Empire. The emperor in Constantinople, Heraclius, understood what was at stake. If Damascus fell, all of Syria would be open to invasion. Egypt would be next. The entire eastern half of his empire could collapse like a house built on sand. So he gathered his armies, called in his best generals, and prepared to defend the jewel of the East. But Heraclius had a problem. His empire was exhausted. Decades of war with Persia had drained the treasury and killed the best soldiers. The provinces were restless, burdened by heavy taxes and religious disputes. Many of the local populations, especially the non-Greek Christians, felt oppressed by Constantinople's heavy hand. They did not love their Byzantine masters, and some even whispered that new rulers might be better than the old. The Muslim forces were led by men whose names would become legend. Khalid ibn al-Walid, called the Sword of God, a general who had never lost a battle. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, a companion of the Prophet known for his wisdom and humility. Amr ibn al-Az, a cunning strategist who could read men and terrain like scrolls. Together, they commanded an army of 20,000 to 30,000 men, disciplined, motivated, and utterly convinced of their destiny. In early 635, this army swept through Palestine and approached Damascus from multiple directions. The Byzantine garrison in the city numbered around 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers. backed by local militias and protected by some of the strongest fortifications in the world. The walls of Damascus were massive, studded with towers, and guarded by experienced soldiers who had fought Persians and survived. The stage was set for a siege that would test not just military might, but faith, endurance, and the will to survive. The Muslims had momentum, the Byzantines had stone, and Damascus, ancient and proud, waited to see which would prove stronger. When the Muslim army first appeared on the horizon in late summer, the people of Damascus watched from the walls with a mixture of fear and confidence. They had supplies enough for months. They had water from the Barada River flowing through the city. They had weapons, soldiers, and the protection of walls that had never been breached by force. The Byzantine commander, a Greek officer named Thomas, walked the ramparts and assessed the threat. He saw an army camped in the orchards and fields outside the city, but he did not see siege towers, battering rams, or the massive engines of war that Roman armies used. The Muslims had cavalry, infantry, and simple equipment. Thomas believed they would try for a few weeks, lose men to arrows and disease, and eventually withdraw. He was wrong. Khalid ibn al-Walid did not approach Damascus like a Roman general. He did not believe in slow starvation or months of waiting. He believed in pressure, maneuver, and finding the weakness in every defense. He divided his forces and surrounded the city from all sides, not to completely seal it, but to create constant tension. The Byzantines could not rest. Every gate had Muslim forces watching. Every movement drew attention. For the defenders, this created psychological strain. They could see the enemy camps, smell their cooking fires, hear their evening prayers echoing across the fields. The Muslims did not hide their presence. They made it felt constant, relentless, like a weight pressing down on the city's chest. Khalid also understood something the Byzantines did not expect. Many of the people inside Damascus were not loyal to Constantinople. The local Arab Christians, the Ghassanids, had served Byzantium for generations, but they felt more kinship with the Muslim Arabs than with their Greek overlords. The Monophysite Christians, whose beliefs differed from official Byzantine doctrine, had suffered persecution and saw no reason to die for an empire that oppressed them. Inside the city, whispers began to spread. Some said the Muslims were offering terms, promises of safety and religious tolerance to those who surrendered peacefully. Others spoke of the battles that had already been fought, of Byzantine armies shattered at Yarmouk and Ajnadain, of Persian cities falling one after another. Fear and doubt crept through the streets like smoke. Khalid sent envoys to the gates, calling for the city to surrender and offering generous terms. The Muslims did not demand conversion, only submission to their rule and payment of a tax. Christians and Jews would be allowed to keep their faith, their property, and their lives. It was a message that resonated with many inside the walls who had grown tired of Byzantine taxation and religious interference. But Thomas refused. He sent the envoys back and declared that Damascus would never surrender to desert raiders. He ordered the gates reinforced, the walls manned day and night, and anyone speaking of surrender to be arrested as a traitor. The city would hold, he insisted, until reinforcements arrived from Constantinople. Outside the walls, Khalid was patient. He knew the city could not be taken by direct assault, not with the forces he had. So he applied pressure from every direction, probing for weaknesses, testing the defenders' resolve, and waiting for the right moment. His cavalry raided supply lines leading into the city. His archers fired volleys at soldiers on the walls, forcing them to stay behind cover. His men dug trenches and built camps within sight of the gates, showing they were not leaving. And at night they sang, prayed, and recited verses from the Quran, their voices carrying over the walls like a reminder of what was coming. Days turned into weeks. The initial confidence of the defenders began to fade. Supplies were still plentiful, but the constant pressure wore on their nerves. Soldiers stood watch for hours under the burning sun. The people inside grew anxious, wondering when the promised Byzantine reinforcements would arrive. Some began to question whether Constantinople even cared about Damascus anymore. Meanwhile, Khalid held councils with his commanders. Abu Ubaidah urged patience, trusting that time would weaken the city's resolve. Omar ibn al-As suggested bribery and negotiation with influential figures inside. But Khalid knew that a prolonged siege could bring Byzantine armies down upon them. He needed Damascus to fall quickly, decisively, and in a way that would shatter Byzantine morale across the entire region. So he began planning something bold. Not a frontal assault, but a multi-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the defenders and exploit every crack in their defense. He would strike at multiple gates simultaneously, create chaos and confusion, and rely on the element of surprise to break through where brute force could not. As the 6th week of the siege began, the Muslim commanders made their final preparations. Scouts reported which sections of the wall were most lightly defended. Spies inside the city sent messages about guard rotations and weak points. And on a moonless night, as the city slept in uneasy silence, the order was given. Tomorrow, Damascus would face the storm. On the morning of September 14, 635, the sky above Damascus was pale and cloudless. The heat had not yet descended, but already the air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. The Byzantine soldiers on the walls went through their morning routines, changing shifts, eating dry bread, and scanning the Muslim camps for signs of movement. At first, everything seemed normal. The enemy campfires burned as usual, horses grazed in the fields. A few riders moved between the camps, but nothing suggested an imminent attack. Thomas walked the eastern wall and felt cautiously optimistic. Another day held was another day closer to relief. But beyond the orchards in the Muslim camps, something very different was happening. Khalid had given his orders the night before, and now his commanders moved with quiet efficiency. Cavalry units mounted their horses in the pre-dawn darkness. Infantry formed into tight columns, weapons checked and ready. Archers prepared their bows, filling quivers with arrows that had been sharpened through the night. The plan was elegant in its complexity. Khalid divided his forces into 4 main assault groups, each targeting a different gate. The eastern gate would face Abu Ubaidah's forces. The northern gate would be struck by Amr ibn al-As. The southern approaches would be harassed by smaller units to pin down defenders. And Khalid himself would lead the main assault on the western Jabiya gate, the largest and most heavily defended entrance to the city. But the true brilliance of the plan lay not in the attacks themselves, but in their timing and coordination. The assaults would begin simultaneously across all fronts, forcing the Byzantines to split their limited reserves and preventing them from concentrating their strength at any single point. And while the defenders focused on repelling the attacks at the gates, a small group of Muslims would attempt something far more daring. Inside the city, a network of sympathizers had been quietly cultivated over the weeks of siege. Some were merchants tired of Byzantine taxes. Others were Arab Christians who felt kinship with their Muslim cousins. A few were simply pragmatists who saw which way the wind was blowing and chose to be on the winning side. These men had sent word to Khalid, describing a section of wall on the eastern side where the defenses were weakest, where a ladder might find purchase, where a small group of brave men might slip inside unnoticed. Khalid chose 30 of his best warriors for this mission. They were young, fearless, and willing to die for the chance to open the gates from within. Their leader was a man named Kaka ibn Ammar, a veteran of countless battles whose name meant the striker. He understood that if they succeeded, Damascus would fall within hours. If they failed, they would die alone inside enemy walls, cut off and outnumbered. As the sun climbed higher, the Muslim forces began to move. It started slowly, almost casually. Cavalry units rode closer to the walls as if merely scouting. Infantry formed up in the orchards, shields raised against the occasional arrow from above. The Byzantines watched with growing unease but did not yet understand what was coming. Then, like a thunderclap, the attack began. From all directions simultaneously, the Muslim forces charged. War cries filled the air, drums pounded. Thousands of men surged toward the gates, shields locked, spears leveled, archers firing volleys that darkened the sky. The walls erupted with the sounds of battle, shouting defenders, clanging steel, the thud of arrows striking wood and flesh. Thomas ran along the ramparts, shouting orders, trying to coordinate a defense against attacks coming from every direction at once. He sent reserves to the eastern gate, then heard that the northern gate was under heavy assault. He ordered archers to concentrate their fire, then realized the southern approaches also needed reinforcements. The coordination he had maintained for weeks began to fray under the pressure of simultaneous crises, and while the battle raged at the gates, 30 shadows moved through the chaos toward the eastern wall. The eastern wall of Damascus rose 30 feet high, built from massive stone blocks that had stood for centuries. Along its length, towers jutted outward, providing overlapping fields of fire for archers and allowing defenders to rain projectiles on anyone foolish enough to approach. But between two of these towers, there was a section that had been damaged years before and repaired with slightly less care, a section where the mortar was newer, the stones slightly smaller, where a skilled climber might find purchase. Kaka ibn al-Mur and his 30 men reached this section just as the main attacks drew the defenders' attention elsewhere. The noise of battle echoed from the gates, the clash of steel, the screams of wounded men, the thunder of rams striking iron-bound wood. On the eastern wall, most of the Byzantine soldiers had rushed toward the sound of combat, leaving only a skeleton crew to watch this quieter sector. The Muslims moved quickly. They carried lightweight rope ladders, grappling hooks wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and weapons strapped to their backs. The first man climbed in silence, his fingers finding cracks between stones, his feet pressing against the wall with practiced care. Behind him, others followed, a line of shadows ascending the ancient stones while the city's attention was elsewhere. The first ladder reached the top. A Byzantine guard, young and nervous, turned at the sound of scraping rope, his eyes widened, his mouth opened to shout a warning. But Kaka was already over the wall, moving with the speed of a hunting cat. A blade flashed. The guard fell without a sound. More Muslims poured over the wall, dropping silently into the city. They moved in practiced formation, securing the nearest tower, killing the few defenders before they could raise the alarm. Within minutes, 30 men had become ghosts inside Damascus, unseen and deadly. Their mission was clear: reach the Jabia gate and open it from within. But between them and that gate lay narrow streets, hostile civilians, and patrols of Byzantine soldiers who would kill them on sight. Kaka gathered his men in the shadow of a building and spoke in a harsh whisper. Speed over stealth now, run hard. Kill anyone in our path, open that gate or die trying. They moved through the streets like a knife cutting through cloth. The city was in chaos. Civilians huddled in their homes, terrified by the sounds of battle at the walls. Byzantine soldiers rushed toward the gates, shouting orders, carrying weapons and supplies. In the confusion, 30 men in simple clothing could almost pass unnoticed. Almost. A Byzantine officer saw them turning a corner, their weapons drawn, moving with military precision. He shouted in alarm. His men drew swords and charged. The Muslims did not slow down. They crashed into the Byzantines with brutal efficiency, stabbing, slashing, pushing forward through the melee. Men fell on both sides. Blood ran across the cobblestones. But the Muslims did not stop. They could not stop. More soldiers appeared, drawn by the sounds of fighting. Kaka realized they would never reach the gate if they kept fighting in the streets. He made a split-second decision. Half of you, hold this corner. The rest, follow me. 15 men formed a desperate rearguard, shields locked, fighting with the fury of those who knew they would die. They held the narrow street against twice their number, buying precious seconds for their brothers to complete the mission. Their swords rose and fell. Their voices roared defiance, and one by one they began to fall. Kaka and the remaining 15 ran through alleys and side streets, their path guided by the sound of battle ahead. They could hear the Jabia gate now, the thunder of rams, the shouts of defenders on the walls above, the roar of Khalid's army pressing from outside. They were close, so close, they burst into the plaza before the gate. Byzantine soldiers turned in shock. The massive wooden gate stood barred and reinforced, held closed by iron brackets and thick wooden beams. On the walls above, archers prepared to fire down on the Muslims outside. It was the strongest point in Damascus's defenses, and 15 exhausted men had somehow reached it from inside. Kaka did not hesitate. The gate! Open the gate! His men charged the Byzantine defenders. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter born of desperation. The Muslims fought with suicidal courage, knowing that every second they delayed meant failure. They crashed into the defenders like a wave breaking on rocks, overwhelming them through sheer ferocity. Kaka reached the gate mechanisms. His hands found the iron brackets. He lifted, pulled, straining against the weight. Behind him, his men fought and died, holding off reinforcements that poured into the plaza. The brackets came free. The wooden beams crashed to the ground. Outside, Khalid heard the sound of wood moving. His eyes widened. The gate is opening. Inside, Kaka threw his weight against the massive doors. They were heavy, so heavy, designed to stop armies, but inch by inch they began to move. Light appeared between them. A gap widened. And through that gap, Khalid's cavalry could see the street beyond. The Muslim army surged forward. The gates burst fully open. Cavalry poured through, hooves thundering on stone, swords raised, voices lifted in cries of victory. Behind them came infantry, wave after wave of warriors flooding into Damascus like water through a broken dam. Kaka stood beside the open gate, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, his sword broken, his men dead around him, but he had done it. He had opened the gates of Damascus, and now the city would fall. The streets of Damascus erupted into chaos. Byzantine soldiers rushed from their positions on the walls, trying to form defensive lines in the narrow alleys and plazas. But they were unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Muslim assault. Khalid's cavalry swept through the main thoroughfares, cutting down anyone who stood in their way, pushing deeper into the heart of the city. Thomas, the Byzantine commander, saw his defenses collapsing around him. He gathered what remained of his garrison and fell back toward the citadel, a fortified compound in the center of Damascus where he hoped to make a final stand. Hundreds of soldiers retreated with him, fighting street by street, house by house, buying time for civilians to flee toward other gates still in Byzantine hands, but the Muslim advance was relentless. Abu Ubaidah's forces broke through the eastern gate, having battered it down after hours of assault. Amr ibn al-Az's men scaled the northern walls using ladders and grappling hooks, overwhelming the defenders who had been pulled away to face the crises elsewhere. From three directions, the Muslim army poured into Damascus, converging on the center. Inside the citadel, Thomas looked out over the burning city and understood that the battle was lost. His men were exhausted, outnumbered, and surrounded. The walls that had protected Damascus for millennia had been breached. The gates that had held against Persians and Mongols now hung open to an enemy his empire had never imagined. A messenger arrived from Khalid ibn al-Walid offering terms. Surrender now, and the remaining soldiers would be allowed to leave with their weapons and their lives. Refuse, and the citadel would be stormed, and no mercy would be given. Thomas looked at his officers, saw the exhaustion and despair in their eyes, and made his decision. He sent word to Khalid that he would surrender. The Byzantine garrison would lay down their arms and march out of Damascus with honor. In return, Khalid promised that the city's population would be spared, that Christians and Jews would be protected, that property would not be looted, and that religious sites would remain unmolested. On the evening of September 18, 635, the gates of the citadel opened. Byzantine soldiers filed out in formation, weapons lowered, banners furled. They walked through streets lined with Muslim warriors, past burning buildings and blood-stained stones, out through the western gate and into exile. Thomas was the last to leave, turning once to look back at the city he had failed to hold. Then he too walked into the gathering darkness, and Damascus belonged to a new world. Khalid entered the city not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a leader bearing responsibility. He immediately ordered his soldiers to stop all fighting, to respect the terms of surrender, and to treat the population with dignity. He walked through the streets, now quiet except for the crackle of dying fires and the weeping of those who mourned their dead. At the great Umayyad Mosque, which in those days was still the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, Khalid met with the city's religious leaders, Christian bishops, Jewish rabbis, and Muslim scholars who had lived in Damascus before the conquest. He spoke to them with respect and confirmed the terms of surrender. Christians would keep their churches. Jews would keep their synagogues. Everyone would pay a tax, but they would be protected by Muslim law and allowed to practice their faith freely. For many in Damascus, this was not the nightmare they had feared. The Muslim rulers proved more tolerant than the Byzantine authorities had been. The religious diversity that had always defined Damascus continued. Trade resumed, markets reopened, and slowly the city began to heal from the wounds of siege and conquest. Word of Damascus's fall spread across the Byzantine Empire like wildfire. In Constantinople, Emperor Heraclius received the news with a sinking heart. He had just defeated the Persians after decades of war, had restored the true cross to Jerusalem, had believed his empire secure. Now, in the space of a few years, he was losing everything he had fought for. Heraclius gathered his generals and demanded answers. How had Damascus fallen so quickly? How had desert tribesmen breached walls that had stood for millennia? His commanders had no good answers. They spoke of fanaticism, of unprecedented coordination, of an enemy willing to die for their faith in ways Byzantine soldiers no longer were. The emperor understood what the fall of Damascus meant. All of Syria was now vulnerable. The road to Antioch lay open. Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, could be next. He ordered new armies to be raised, new taxes to be levied, new strategies to be devised. But the momentum had shifted. The age of Byzantine dominance in the east was ending, and a new power was rising to take its place. For Khalid ibn al-Walid, the conquest of Damascus was not an end, but a beginning. He knew that holding the city would be harder than taking it. Byzantine armies would return, local populations might rebel, rivals within the Muslim leadership might challenge his authority. But he had proven something that would echo through history. That walls, no matter how strong, could not stop an army that believed its cause was just. That empires, no matter how ancient, could fall to those with faith and vision. In the months that followed, Khalid consolidated Muslim control over Syria. He won more battles, conquered more cities, and became the most feared general in the Islamic world. But he never forgot the men who had died opening the gates of Damascus. He ordered monuments built to honor them, poems written to remember their sacrifice, and prayers said for their souls. The fall of Damascus changed the course of history in ways that are still felt today. It marked the beginning of Islamic rule in the Levant that would last for centuries. It shattered Byzantine power in the region and opened the door to further conquests. Within a decade, Jerusalem would fall. Within 20 years, Egypt would be Muslim. Within a century, Islamic armies would stand at the gates of Tours in France and the borders of India. But more than territory, the fall of Damascus represented a shift in the civilizational balance of power. The ancient world of Rome and Persia gave way to a new Islamic civilization that would preserve and transmit Greek philosophy, develop advanced mathematics and astronomy, and create architectural and literary masterpieces that still inspire wonder. The people of Damascus adapted to their new rulers with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some converted to Islam, drawn by faith or seeking social advancement. Others remained Christian or Jewish, living under Muslim protection and contributing to the city's rich cultural tapestry. Damascus became a center of Islamic learning and governance, eventually serving as the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, the first great Islamic empire. The Byzantine soldiers who had defended Damascus scattered across the empire. Some retired to their homes, carrying memories of the siege and the fall. Others joined new armies raised to fight the Muslim advance. Thomas, the Byzantine commander, reportedly lived out his days in Anatolia, haunted by the memory of the gates opening and the enemy pouring through. For the Muslim soldiers who had fought at Damascus, the city became a legend, a proof that faith and courage could overcome any obstacle. Stories of Kaka ibn Omar and his 30 warriors were told around campfires for generations. Young men dreamed of similar glory. Commanders studied Khalid's tactics, trying to replicate his genius. But perhaps the most profound impact of Damascus's fall was psychological. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had represented permanence. The continuation of Roman glory, the unshakable fortress of Christendom in the East. When Damascus fell, that illusion shattered. If such an ancient and powerful city could fall to a new and seemingly weaker enemy, then nothing was permanent. No empire was invincible. History was not fixed but fluid, shaped by the courage and determination of those willing to fight for their vision of the future. The siege and fall of Damascus also revealed the importance of internal cohesion. The Byzantine garrison had fought bravely, but they were defending a city whose population was divided, where Greek overlords ruled over Syrians, Arabs, and others who felt little loyalty to Constantinople. The Muslims, by contrast, offered a unifying vision, a community based not on ethnicity but on faith, where Arab and non-Arab could stand as equals before God. This lesson would be learned and relearned throughout history. Empires built on conquest and coercion are vulnerable when faced with movements that offer genuine community and shared purpose. The Byzantines had military strength, but the Muslims had something more powerful, a cause that men were willing to die for. As decades passed and Damascus flourished under Muslim rule, the city became a symbol of the Islamic Golden Age. Poets sang of its gardens and fountains. Scholars gathered in its libraries and madrasas. Merchants from across the known world met in its bazaars. The Umayyad Mosque, built on the site of the old cathedral, became one of the architectural wonders of the world, its mosaics and columns a testament to the sophisticated civilization that had emerged from the Arabian deserts. But the city never forgot its moment of transformation, that September day in 635 when everything changed. Old men would tell their grandchildren of the siege, of the gates opening, of the world they had known ending and a new world beginning. The stones of the walls still bore the scars of battle. The streets still echoed with the memory of that final desperate fight. For historians looking back, the fall of Damascus represents one of those hinge points where the trajectory of human civilization shifted. Had Damascus held, the Muslim advance might have stalled. Byzantine reinforcements might have arrived. The Islamic expansion might have been contained. The world we know today would be fundamentally different, but Damascus did not hold. The gates opened, and through those gates flowed not just an army but a new way of organizing society, a new vision of empire, a new chapter in human history that would shape the world for over 1,000 years and continues to influence our present. The story of Damascus's fall reminds us that no fortress is impregnable, no empire eternal, and no victory guaranteed. It teaches that courage and faith can overcome overwhelming odds, that clever tactics can defeat superior numbers, and that the course of history can turn on the actions of a few brave individuals willing to risk everything for their cause. When Kaka ibn Amr stood beside those open gates, bleeding from a dozen wounds, watching Khalid's army pour through, he could not have known that he was witnessing one of the most important moments in human history. He knew only that he had done his duty, that he had given everything for his faith and his brothers. And in that moment of sacrifice and triumph, he became part of something far greater than himself. The ancient walls of Damascus still stand today, weathered by centuries but enduring. They have witnessed the rise and fall of countless rulers, the ebb and flow of civilizations, the endless drama of human ambition and courage. And if you walk beside those walls at dawn, when the city is quiet and the light is soft, you can almost hear the echoes of that September morning in 635, when the gates opened and the world changed forever.